Tonight we begin a message series that will go 6 weeks, starting tonight. And the title, Seriously, God? It's about trying to make sense of life when, in fact, life doesn't make sense. You know, at first glance, life can feel overwhelming. And if it's not overwhelming, maybe you'll agree with me that at least sometimes it can be confusing. Many of us, when we're faced with hardships, may find ourselves angry or disappointed with God. That's normal, and it's okay. How often have you asked this question? How can a good God allow bad things to happen? Some of us feel betrayed, or we even distance ourselves from faith. We tend to blame God for the trials and the tribulations in life. And some people get so mad at God that they walk away from the faith, the church, or anything that has to do with religion. Throughout the next 5 weeks, this series will explore the very real frustrations that challenge our trust in God. It's important to remember that you're not alone in the way you experience God this way sometimes. Not only the person sitting next to you has a similar experience, but all we need to do is to go back to the Old Testament, to some of the key figures who felt disconnected from God, a sense of dissonance because of their life circumstances. And how could such a good God let these life circumstances exist? There may be some of you sitting here returning to church after a while. And it could be possible that it's some of these very reasons that I mentioned that kept you from coming to church. Maybe you grew up hearing nothing but rules, and at the very first moment you could, you escaped. Or maybe you hold the belief that God is simply against everything. Maybe some have turned away because of a deep disappointment. God didn't answer my prayers. Or we find ourselves at work or in different circumstances with people who are in charge, in leadership roles, and we say, really, God? But then again, there's more. The struggle with the existence of pain and suffering. How could a caring God allow poverty, illness, and injustice to exist? I'm not finished. There's death, especially untimely death. It just raises more questions. If any of these struggles have caused you to drift from faith, you've chosen the right time to be here. And like I said, the next 5 weeks will take each of those topics and try to break them open to see how God is working in our lives, especially in those moments of dissonance or distraction. So it's my job tonight to try and lay out for us a foundation that will help us understand how to understand God. I'd like to do it by explaining 3 principles that I hope will be at work throughout the next 5 weeks. And I'd like to invite you to hear these principles, to take them in, and to apply them to how we break open the next 5 weeks. Let me say what the 3 principles are, and then I'll explain them. The first, it makes sense that God doesn't make sense. It makes sense that God doesn't make sense. The second is this: even though God doesn't make sense, we can come to an understanding of God. You see, our God is relational and slowly reveals God's self to us. And so that principle will be at work over the next 5 weeks. And the third, there is a difference between God not making sense and life not making sense. So let's dive into them quickly. The first, remember, is it makes sense that God doesn't always make sense. If God is all-knowing, all-wise, doesn't it stand to reason that our limited perspective will sometimes leave us confused about God's ways? God has all of the past and holds all of the future. And we have just this one little moment of time. Our perspective cannot match the tapestry that God holds and understands. If God were like us, God wouldn't be God. And so it makes sense that God doesn't always make sense. Even though God doesn't always make sense, isn't there that desire on God's part to reveal God's self to us? God does that through Scripture, through the church, especially through Jesus. Catholicism isn't merely a set of doctrines. It's a relationship where God reached out to a people and said, I will be your God and you will be my people. And Jesus came to fix the misconceptions. You see, people thought that God was an angry God, a judgmental God, until Jesus shared the parable of the prodigal son. It was really the story of a prodigal father who loved so freely, wasn't angry. And then there was the misconception that Jesus addressed, that God only loved certain people. So he told the parable of the Good Samaritan, where everyone is our neighbor. And ultimately, Jesus cleared up the misconception that God expects us to be perfect before accepting us by dying on the cross. In the gospel tonight, we heard that phrase that we've heard so many times. How can the blind lead the blind? Another way of saying that is that it is precisely in our unknowing that God is at work revealing himself to us. We need to engage in the challenging questions, because this is an opportunity to deepen our understanding. It has to be a pursuit that's rooted in faith. In fact, the most widely accepted definition of theology is faith seeking understanding. And that is what we will be about these next 5 weeks. Maybe we'll become theologians. The third principle is very important. There's a difference between God not making sense and life not making sense. In all of our lives, there are situations and circumstances that unfold in ways that contradict what we believe to be God's will. And then that well-meaning person comes along and says, "It is God's will that you suffer." It's crucial to understand that God does not desire suffering, poverty, or injustice. Theologians will often distinguish between God's preferred will and God's permissive will. You see, God yearns for a world defined by love. And at the very same time, God allows free will, permitting actions contrary to God's intentions. This freedom is essential for genuine love to flourish. These are the 3 principles. It's okay that God doesn't make sense. God is always desiring to reveal himself to us. And finally, the difference between God not making sense and life not making sense. These are the principles, please, to try and keep in mind as we break open these topics. So let me wrap up this week. And I'd like you to make one of 2 commitments. The first is this. If you're here for the first time, or maybe not so regularly, would you make a commitment to come back? And if you choose not to come back, that's okay. There's the opportunity to listen to the homilies. They're live streamed or they're recorded. But let God work in you over these weeks. If you're a regular, I know that you know someone who needs to hear this. Could you reach out to them and invite them? Let's face it. At best, life is confusing. At times, we need to make sense out of life. When God doesn't make sense, we will seek to understand God. And as we seek to understand God, God promises that we will find God.